Okay, so again, welcome back to Zoom into Archaeology. And this week, I'm really delighted to be speaking with everyone again. For the last couple of months, I've been having other speakers come in because I think it's nice to have a diversity of people speaking in these talks. And so you're not just hearing me talk about topics that are interesting to me every week. But this week, I am glad to be here talking about a topic that's interesting to me because it's about the Julee Cottage. And the Julee Cottage is a building or a structure, a historic structure in downtown Pensacola that's right outside my window here. And I get to look at it almost every day when I come down to the office. So it's exciting for me to get to talk about it. The Destination Archaeology Resource Center, which is the museum of the Florida Public Archaeology Network here in Pensacola, has a rotating exhibit on the Julee Cottage, which is on display right now. I think it went on display in January of this year, and unfortunately our museum is still closed due to COVID-19 and now due to the effects of flooding from Hurricane Sally. But a lot of the information in this talk is from the exhibit and the research that was done for the exhibit by one of our graduate assistants, former graduate assistants, Rachel Hines. So I'm really pleased to be talking about the Julee Cottage with you all today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see what I'm talking about. All right. Let me pull up the chat box and let me pull up all of our participants. And if someone could go ahead and just let me know if they see the screen that I'm sharing, which should be the title slide for the presentation, I would appreciate it. It's hard for me to see. Excellent. Thank you, Philip. Great. All right, so let's get started. So the Julee Cottage provided a home for free people of color for over a century in Pensacola. But freedom looked very different for each generation. The stories of the families who lived in this home exposed the changing ideas about race and freedom throughout Pensacola's history. And let's see. Sorry, letting more people into the room here. There we go. So the Julee Cottage kind of embodies this aspect of Pensacola's history and heritage. And that's why it's a really good primer for a lot of this history. So before we jump right in, let's define what we mean by free people of color. This community of people in Pensacola were of African descent who were born free or escaped enslavement during the colonial and antebellum or pre-Civil War periods. By the time Florida became a United States territory in 1821, Pensacola had a thriving multiracial population, many of whom were Creole. Now, the term Creole has been used in various ways over time, but along the Gulf Coast, the term generally referred to free people of color with both European and African ancestry. Now, our goal with this presentation is to explore some of the primary documents and archaeological evidence to learn more about the Julee Cottage and the people who live there, and of course, about Pensacola and Northwest Florida history. Let more people in the room here. Okay. So a little bit of history about the cottage itself. The Julee Cottage was built by a German expatriate, Francis Hindenburg, no relation, I think, to the Hindenburg, around 1805. He described the building as a low wooden house, which I have built at my own expense. He sold that house shortly after he built it to Julee Panton, who was a free woman of color and the building's namesake. He sold it to her in 1808 for $300. When addresses were assigned to the building, the Julee Cottage property became 214 West Zaragoza Street. And in this image here, which is from the UWF Historic Trust, you can see the Julee Cottage as the building on the right. Let's see. There we go. There we go. Building on the right. And so this image was not taken, obviously, in 1808 when the building was constructed. This image was taken in 1927, but it is the Julee Cottage there on the right and its neighbor house on the left there. Now in this image, you can see the Julee Cottage highlighted in red on Zaragoza Street. And this map, if you haven't joined us before, you haven't probably seen one of these. They've been featured in many of our presentations. This map is what we call a Sanborn Fire Insurance Map. And these maps, which were kept for insurance purposes, obviously, are one of the best records about building locations, sizes, and ownership in urban areas. If you're familiar with Pensacola, you'll see Main Street running along the water right here, looking a little different than it does today. Today, a good portion of made land is south of Main Street. So this is all fill and trash that was created or put into the waterfront to extend the shoreline out. In this particular location near where the Julee Cottage is, just south today is the Community Maritime Park and the Blue Wahoos baseball stadium, which is also home to the UWF, or University of West Florida football team. Go Argos. Now in 1968, the Historic American Building Survey, frequently referred to as HABS, recorded the Julee Cottage, which was significant because it was one of the oldest buildings in Pensacola then, and it's one of the only remaining examples of built-to-sidewalk style structures in the city. So in this image, you can see the really simple floor layout. You have 4 rooms with a staircase leading up to an attic or a loft area. This next image gives you kind of a profile and cutaway view of the Julee Cottage. The Julee is what we refer to as a salt box style building, which refers to its asymmetrical roof and its rectangular floor plan. The house sits on brick piers, and the original wood siding showed traces of red paint when it was recorded by HABS in 1968. An addition on the building was constructed in the 20th century to modernize the bathroom. But despite this, the structure actually retained much of its original materials. The walls are nailed with square head cut nails, and there were observable adze and axe marks on the cut wood. So much of this house was made prior to any machined goods for construction, which is really impressive, especially in 1968, to have that still around. Okay, so who is the Julee of the Julee Cottage? Well, Julee is listed in various historical records as Julee, Julie, July, Judry, and Judith. Though there is no direct evidence, a number of documents indicate that Julee, a free woman of color when she lived in the cottage, was formerly enslaved by the Panton, Leslie, and Company. It is important to remember that at the time, Pensacola was once again under Spanish rule. So again, we're talking about the early 1800s. England had lost their hold on West Florida following the end of the American Revolution. Spain was an ally to the American revolutionaries, and with their cooperation, a siege led by Bernardo de Galvez successfully drove the English back out of Pensacola and eventually out of the rest of Florida as well. And the Spanish had very different attitudes than the British about the enslavement of people by this time, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Panton, Leslie and Company, though created by a group of loyalist Scottish merchants, was allowed to continue operating in Florida following the transition to Spanish rule, mostly because they dominated trade with nearby Creek and Seminole tribes. That was something that the Spanish weren't really doing. So in 1804, the company, Panton, Leslie and Company, reorganized and became John Forbes and Company. And Julee would have worked under John Forbes and Company as well. Now, the image on the left here shows a claim, which has been translated and typed out, filed to the Spanish governor of West Florida on behalf of Judry Panton for the ownership of the lot and the home at 214 West Zaragoza Street. The document on the right describes a Spanish survey with lot number 66 belonging to Judith Forbes, a free negress, as she is described. Each of these documents is likely talking about the same person. Not only are the names similar, but there are no other records for home sales between these times. It is interesting, however, that Julee, as we know and call her, goes by both the Panton and Forbes surnames. So we wonder if that was a strategic placement of her name or a way to describe herself. This is an interesting primary document as well. This is a list of people enslaved by Panton, Leslie and Company, and it includes a woman named Julia, which is highlighted in red down there in the left-hand corner. Is this our Julee of the Julee Cottage? Probably it is. So we've talked about Julee. Let's talk a little bit about the Spanish Sistema de Castas, or caste system. This is pertinent for this discussion in a couple of different ways. So this system, which was in effect during Spanish control of West Florida, after they took it back from the British, it would have classified Pensacolians into racial groups, such as what they would have described as Negroes, people of African ancestry, and mulattoes, those with a quarter or more of African blood. Spain was more liberal than other colonial powers like England in terms of racial relations. And though people of color residing in New Spain, what they referred to as the Spanish colonies in the New World, these people still faced prejudice, but they were afforded more opportunities than those living in other colonies under other countries' rules, like England. Now, the images that you see here and the next couple of ones are paintings of different caste classifications, paintings by Jose Joaquin Magon, which were painted sometime between 1751 and 1800. So they're very interesting, and without knowing a lot of Spanish, you can kind of see the classifications that are toward the top on this image, describing the marriage or the production of a child between a Spaniard and an Indian, producing a mestiza, for example. And of course, there are several other different descriptions of Spanish caste. Probably my favorite thing about these paintings are the terrible faces on the small children. They're terrifying. Oop, sorry, go ahead. But one of the things that's also really interesting about these kinds of historical documents from an anthropological perspective is that they say a lot about how Europeans in this period were constantly trying to classify the world around them and to exert a sense of control over it, right? If you can classify something, you can control it, or at least you feel like you have control over it. And a lot of this was an outgrowth of the Enlightenment era, right? Scientific discovery and explanation of things provided a way to rationalize the world around yourself, right? And a lot of this was an outgrowth of that. All right, moving forward. So, in 1819, Pensacola started the process of becoming a part of the United States. And what we see here is kind of a grainy image of, it's an etching of Andrew Jackson coming to Pensacola. And this image was produced as part, when he came to Pensacola during the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson actually came to Pensacola multiple times to try and take it from the Spanish. But finally that happened. The West Florida was transferred to the Spanish to the Americans, led by Andrew Jackson in 1821. He became the governor of West Florida. But this transition to becoming a part of the United States brought a whole new set of social norms to the area. Laws passed in the Gulf Coast started to greatly limit the freedoms of free Black and mulatto citizens as they had been classified under the Spanish. And as early as 1829, a law threatened to sell any free Black migrants in the Florida territory at auction for a term of 5 years. Now by 1845, every free person of color now had to pay a $3 tax compared to the 50-cent tax paid by white and enslaved citizens. And in 1848, the now state of Florida passed a law requiring each free person of color to have a white guardian. So the situation of life, or the quality of life for these people, drastically changed when the Pensacola and West Florida area became a part of the United States. So what did this mean for the status quo under the Spanish? Well, flexible Spanish social norms were placed under a higher level of scrutiny, and formerly acceptable practices, such as interracial relationships, were no longer tolerated by the American government. In 1844, Julee Cottage resident Juan Mal went to court for living in sin with Gertrude Sermacal, a free mulatto woman. A decade later, the same thing happened to Julee Cottage residents Bartholomew Boris and Carmelita Minagro, who in this 1860 federal census image is listed as Anne, but you can see Bartholomew's name, Anne's name, and then the name of their children. Now, despite these challenges, Bartholomew and Carmelita had 8 children and lived in the Julee Cottage until her death in 1864. When Bartholomew died 30 years later, they were buried together at St. Michael's Cemetery in Pensacola, which is shown, their tomb is shown in this image here. The Julee Cottage remained in their family for the next 100 years. And kind of as a fun fact here, St. Michael's Cemetery in Pensacola is the oldest existing cemetery in Pensacola and the second oldest in the state of Florida. The oldest being the Tolomado Cemetery in St. Augustine, Florida, which is also worth a visit if you happen to be in St. Augustine. Now, although the cemetery is closed right now due to damage from Hurricane Sally and efforts to kind of clear out all the limbs and debris that came in with the hurricane, it is typically open every day from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. and is absolutely worth a visit. So another primary document. In 1887, Bartholomew Boris deeded Julee Cottage to his daughter, Mary Boris Nicholas, for the price of $5 in love, which I find incredibly sweet. And this is shown in the property deed right here. She eventually married a Spanish fisherman, John Remus, a few years later in 1889. Now, despite the eruption of the Civil War, the Boris family was able to retain ownership of the Julee Cottage into the next century. The map in this image was drawn in 1885 and shows that Pensacola was becoming a different city entirely by 1900. Businesses were rebuilt after the Civil War, and new northern entrepreneurs poured money into the burgeoning lumber and fishing industries. The number of wharves along the city's waterfront expanded, and people from all over the world were attracted to Pensacola to earn a living. Walking along the waterfront during this period, you would have heard more languages being spoken then than you would ever hear today, which is really incredible. It was such a diverse period of our history. Now, despite this, racial relations, of course, intensified throughout this Jim Crow era, right? Creoles and mulattoes, or people typified that way, who were once part of a middle status group in the city, were starting to be lumped together with all non-white citizens as colored. The Pensacola city directories were separated into white and colored sections during this time, it's really illustrative of the city's emphasis on segregation during this period. Some Creole individuals were able to take advantage of their lighter skin color, though this did cause some divisions within the community. So let's go back to the Remus family, right? Knowing our historical context. So John Remus, which is shown in this image here, I realize it's a little bit grainy. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a very high resolution copy, but this is John Remus. And Mary Remus, his wife, who, if we remember, was Bartholomew Boris's daughter, and their children lived at the Julee Cottage during this transitional time period, during this Jim Crow era post-Civil War. Records about the Remus family illustrate kind of changing ideas about race during this time period. So they're very illustrative, again, of what is going on in a city and nationwide context. At different times, various historical records show their race as Black, Creole, and white. So in 1907, the Pensacola City Directory, of which we have 2 excerpts right here, it was divided into 2 sections based on race, like we said. John Remus was listed in the white section of the Pensacola Directory as John Remus, spelled R-A-Y-M-O-S, and you see that highlighted in red. Even though he lacked African ancestry, he was also listed in the colored section as John Remus, Ramous. You can see highlighted in red there. And his status as a colored individual is indicated by the asterisk you see right next to his name. Now, John Remus was a bartender during this period, and he may have been attempting to attract both Black and white audiences, using his ambiguous race to his advantage. Pensacola was a diverse place, right? And a lot of businesses catered to diverse clientele, despite these kind of segregation issues. And so possibly what John Remus was trying to do was appeal to two different groups of people for business. And why wouldn't you take advantage of that if you could? Now, John and Mary's children lived in the Julee Cottage until 1970, when John Remus Jr. passed away. The house was located on the edge of the Tanyard, a Creole neighborhood which was home to Pensacolians of mixed African and Spanish ancestry, and many people who were of working class along the city waterfront. And you can see in this photo on the left, this is a 1907 photo, not of the Remus family, but taken in the Tanyard area. And this 1907 photo was published in a 1985 Pensacola News Journal article about the Tanyard area. And so that's what you're seeing on the left. Now, for those unfamiliar with Pensacola, the Tanyard has historically been a vibrant and racially diverse residential neighborhood filled with Creole and shotgun cottages. Much of the activity in this neighborhood grew up around the downtown Pensacola's working waterfront, which included the Frisco Docks and the Bruce Dry Dock Company. When those industries largely disappeared from the waterfront by the mid-1900s, redevelopment changed the character of the neighborhood, and not necessarily for the better. The construction of the governmental center district in the 1970s saw entire blocks of homes in this neighborhood demolished to make way for state and local government buildings, including the current N.C. Blanchard Judicial Center, the Chappie James State Building, and City Hall. Now, what you're seeing in the image to the right is an aerial photograph of that Tanyard area. And you can see the area known as Bruce Beach, where Bruce Dry Docks would have been, Bruce Beach Pool, all places of important heritage in this neighborhood. And this image, I believe, was taken sometime in the 1960s before the demolition of a lot of those homes to make way for the governmental buildings. Yes, okay. So another census image here. When John Remus Jr. died in 1970, his niece, Julee Soto Boris, inherited the property. As a young girl, she had actually lived in the Julee Cottage with her parents and siblings at least for a few years, and that's what you're seeing in this census image from 1920. So you can actually see the cottage, or the street, the address name, the address number, 214, and then you can see the family listed out here, and Julia, of course, being right here. She was 15 at the time of the census. The Remus family lived in the Julee Cottage, like we said, until the early 1970s, when it was eventually donated by Julee Soto Boris to be used as a museum. And so the image that you're seeing here is of the Julee Cottage in 1968, before it was moved, restored, and became a museum in historic Pensacola Village. In 1977, the cottage was officially moved to historic Pensacola Village, where it remains today. When it was restored in the 1980s, Marshall Emerson of the Historic Pensacola Preservation Board noted that Julee Cottage was the first museum for Black heritage in the state of Florida. 1980s. And just a couple of additional images of Julee Cottage in 1968. What we saw on this slide was the front, so that built to sidewalk nature of the structure, which you can see there. This is the back of the Julee Cottage, and you can see where that extension was put on in the 20th century as a bathroom, right here. Let's see. And then we have some interior shots of Julee Cottage too. So you can see what the building would have looked like on the inside. So the doors, some of the the beadboard and tongue and groove in this kitchen area here, what looks like a bedroom off to the left here with the painting. So really, really great images taken of this cottage before it eventually was moved and restored. Now here's another great image, again from UWF Historic Trust, when the cottage was moved from the west side of Pensacola, West Zaragoza, across the main drag, which is Palafox Street, to the east side of Pensacola into historic Pensacola Village. And you can see that they're using what looks like a tractor here and then a platform to move that cottage across town. Pretty incredible feat of engineering to get this thing from one side of the city to the other. So before the Julee Cottage was moved to its current location, Leora Sutton of the Pensacola Historic Preservation Society conducted archaeological excavations of the site in the 1970s. And what you see here is an image of Sutton right here in this photo with a excavation crew. Now this photo was taken in 1975 when this crew was working at the Panton Leslie and Company site on the west side of town. So this is not from the Julee Cottage excavations, but it is an accurate photo of Sutton and the crew that probably excavated the Julee Cottage site once it was moved. And so here's another photo of that 1975 excavation crew at the Panton Leslie and Company site, who likely also would have worked on excavations at Julee Cottage. And so thinking about archaeology a little bit and what we know from Leora Sutton's excavations, we do have some artifact remains. So a lot of the artifacts pictured on this slide are from the 19th century. So we know that in the earliest years, the Julee Cottage provided a home to free women of color. Artifacts like these would have been commonly used in 19th century households and may have belonged to some of the women we talked about earlier, like Julee. Handmade shell and glass buttons and utilitarian goods like the bottle were practical and provide insight into the economic status of their owners. Interestingly, these artifacts reveal that their owners may have had some access to fine goods, like these hand-painted ceramics that you see on the left here. Beautiful ceramics, actually. Clay pipe stems and the accompanying tobacco that would have been with those. These clay pipe stems are something that archaeologists commonly find on sites from the 19th century, before we have the cigarettes that we know today. These very white clay pipes would have been produced, and as people would have smoked the pipes and the tobacco in the pipes, they would snap off little bits of the pipe stems, because obviously the moisture would create, it would essentially, melt the clay a little bit so that it would be harder to smoke. So you would snap off the end, and then you would have a brand new spot to smoke off of on your clay pipe stem. So we do find those little pieces of clay pipe stems pretty commonly. And another interesting artifact from the site was this iron stirrup. So we know that, having horses and buying horse tack is not something that's inexpensive. So this might kind of reveal a little bit about the middle class status of the people living at this cottage in the 19th century. Now moving into the 20th century, we know that the Remus family lived in Julee Cottage for almost a century. Many of the late 19th century and 20th century artifacts that we have likely belong to them. This glass marble may have belonged to John Remus Jr. and Louis Remus as kids, or even to Julia Boris, who donated the cottage and lived there briefly as a young girl. The lead fishing weight likely belonged to John Remus Sr., who worked as a fisherman. And Mary Remus probably used this Homer Laughlin ceramic vessel, which was made in Ohio in 1909. And we know that, of course, because it does have that very telling maker's mark on the bottom. Now here's another really interesting artifact, and it kind of embodies for me what is interesting about archaeology. So this brass drive hook is the type of hook that was driven into heavy timbers and was commonly used throughout the 1800s, though it was usually made of iron. This brass hook probably came from a ship, and the reason why we think that is because brass is typically used on vessels because brass doesn't get rusty at sea, unlike iron. So unfortunately, when these artifacts, all of the artifacts that I've shown you, were excavated, the provenience or the contextual information, where they were located in the ground and where they were in relation to other artifacts, was not recorded by Leora Sutton. Archaeology in the 1970s, undertaken by avocationals, was very different than it was today. Of course, today there are a lot of laws and regulations about how we do archaeology so that it's done properly. So we don't know a whole lot about this hook. Was it used by newly freed women of color like Julee, who would have repurposed available items? Or was this hook taken by John Remus Sr., the fisherman, as a souvenir from a ship? And again, one of the most interesting things about archaeology is that we can only guess how artifacts like this would have made it to a site like Julee Cottage. Any explanation is just as valid as another. Artifacts like these have fascinating stories to tell about the people that use them. So the Julee Cottage today. The Julee Cottage continues to stand after over 2 centuries, but many other historic places in Pensacola have been lost along the way. Now, kind of the legacy of all of this is the buildings that we choose to save determine the historic landscape of our communities, and in this case, Pensacola. And that in turn dictates the stories that we tell about our past. A really good example of this is the demolition of many homes and structures in the Tanyard neighborhood for new governmental buildings in the 1970s, right? We don't have those buildings anymore to interpret for the public. And in turn, we don't have that Black and Creole heritage to share with people visiting Pensacola. Now in 2016, the John Sunday Society formed in an effort to save a historic house once owned by a prominent African-American leader of the same name, John Sunday. He was born in Pensacola in 1838, volunteered for the Army, served under Ulysses S. Grant in the Civil War, and afterwards served as a state legislator and city alderman. Though his former home was demolished in 2016, despite the best efforts of preservationists, the John Sunday Society continues to advocate for the preservation of Pensacola's history and for places like the Julee Cottage that represent our city's diverse past. So today, the Julee Cottage serves as a museum, and it's located in historic Pensacola Village. You can visit the site, you can visit Julee Cottage for yourself, and you can find more information on how to do that at Historic Pensacola's website, which is, of course, historicpensacola.org. So another thing I want to make sure to mention before I finish up here is that, as we've seen, Pensacola and Northwest Florida have incredibly diverse histories, influenced by their connection to the sea and the many colonial entities that left indelible marks on our natural and cultural landscape. So earlier in the presentation, you heard me mention that Julee Cottage was one of the only places in Florida that celebrated the state's Black and Creole heritage, even into the 1980s. Well, the good news is that that has changed significantly, especially in Pensacola. If you travel to the city today, I encourage you all to visit these places, including the Chappie James Museum of Pensacola, which tells the story of America's first African-American four-star general in the U.S. Air Force, born here in Pensacola. The African-American Heritage Society of Pensacola, which has both museum hours and excellent programming when it is open. Of course, closed right now due to COVID-19, but you can follow them on Facebook. The Ezra Gary Museum and Research Center, which will honor the history and culture of the historic Belmont de Villiers neighborhood here in Pensacola, and that planned opening is soon. Again, you can follow them on Facebook. Pensacola also has a cultural heritage trail that honors diversity in the community, which is available online, and I can provide links to all of these if you all are interested in getting those after the talk. And Florida, the Florida Department of State created a Florida Black Heritage Trail, which is also available online. And it's comprised of sites that you can visit in person and that have interpreted Black heritage. So all of these are fantastic resources for celebrating our community's diversity. And so just to end, I want to say thank you, of course, to Rachel Hines, who provided the bulk of the research for this presentation, and some additional work by Mike Toman, who is our museum manager here at the Destination Archaeology Resource Center, which is in our FPAN Coordinating Center. I want to thank you all for joining me today. We had a smaller group than we usually have, but I think that's probably my fault because I wasn't able to get October speakers together as quickly as I normally am because of the hurricane. But I hope you all enjoyed learning about the Julee Cottage, a little bit more about Pensacola's diverse history, and I hope it encourages you to check out some of the other amazing resources online and some of the museums here in town that offer a little bit more varied interpretation about our community's past. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any questions about Julee Cottage or about Pensacola, history, archaeology. Thanks to you all for joining me. I appreciate the good feedback on the presentation. If you all enjoyed the Zoom into Archaeology talk today, you'll really enjoy the speakers that we have coming up in the rest of October. We're taking a week off next week, so no presentation on October 8th, but join us on October 15th because we'll have Dr. Remus Family, an associate professor at the University of West Florida, talking about Pensacola and Northwest Florida in general, or the Southeast really, talking about some of the indigenous American archaeology and some of the new thinking about that archaeology. And he's titled this presentation, 14,500 Years in 30 Minutes. So that'll be a really interesting one. If you don't know, Florida has some of the oldest archaeological sites in the continental United States, which is really, really fascinating. It's interesting to think that Florida, being so far away from Alaska and the interior, has some of the oldest sites, but we do, and mostly because of the excellent preservation that we have underwater here. And so Dr. Grinnan will talk about that a little bit. Let's see, so I don't see any particular questions. I know some people joined the presentation a little bit late today. If you want to go back and see what you missed on the presentation about Julee Cottage, check out the FPAN YouTube channel, which you can just search FPAN or Florida Public Archaeology Network YouTube, and you'll see the presentation listed there. Usually it takes me about a day or two to get it up, so it'll definitely be there by Monday. So if we don't have any questions, thank you all again for joining me today for Zoom into Archaeology. I hope that we'll see you not next Thursday because we're taking next week off, but in some of our future presentations. We have great presentations lined up for the end of October. So thank you all, and hopefully I will see you soon.